my name's Rebecca Bowen. I'm a PhD researcher here at the University of Oxford in the subfaculty of Italian.
Hi, I'm Maga. I'm a second year doing French and Italian at Somerville College.
Hi, I'm Pauline. I'm also a second year doing French and Italian, and I study at St. Peter's College.
Great. So before we begin, I should say that we'll refer mostly to the Italian. So if you're not so well versed in Italian, I would suggest that you read the English translation thoroughly before watching the rest of the video. Okay, great. So have you guys read the book that this passage comes from?
I haven't.
Neither have I.
Okay.
I'm doing Calvino next term, so...
Okay, great.
Start.
And Pauline, you were saying you've actually just studied a bit of Calvino.
Yes, exactly, but different books.
Okay, so this extract comes from his 1972 novel Città, invisibili, invisible cities. The whole book is a collection of short descriptions of probably imaginary cities as told by the Italian adventurer Marco Polo to the Levantine emperor Kublai Khan. And in between these descriptions we get these moments of conversation that describe the dialogue between Marco Polo and Kublai Khan. And one such is what we're looking at today. So shall we just dive in with the first question then? And perhaps we can talk a bit about how this passage engages with notions of language.
So when I read it, at first I got aware of the situation where there's someone who's in a context where there's a foreign language spoken and the person can't really speak that language, but then communication develops anyway. And I thought that it reminded me also a bit of the process of how a child learns to speak, because at first there's these gestures and then objects, sounds, kind of the development of just showing something and then gradually being able to express it in phrases and with words.
Great, so kind of the development of language going on in this passage. And what about you, Maga? What did you notice about the ways that it's engaging with language as a kind of concept in this passage?
I picked out the idea of oggetti, so the idea of objects, and to convey meaning in the sense that they're different, kind of, in a way, cultural symbols that depict an idea. And then it goes on to say about imitando, so copying, which is, I guess, as Pauline was saying, the kind of second stage of learning to communicate, where you then copy people's actions and words. But I thought it was interesting the fact that the objects and that kind of symbolism comes first as a way of conveying meaning.
Right, absolutely. So this kind of building of a language, but out of kind of pre-verbal or kind of non-verbal communicative tools, right? So, Pauline, you've rightly said that there's an idea of development here, and then Maga, you've brought in this idea of objects. And I guess my next question would be, how does this language of objects, but also of gesti, of like gestures, as it's described in the last paragraph, how does this compare to the kind of verbal language that is also described in that last paragraph? So it says, here, le parole andarono sostituendosi agli oggetti e ai gesti. So words began to replace this original language of objects and gestures. Any thoughts on how these two languages are then compared, the non-verbal and the verbal?
So it is the later stage of this development to kind of see, now we've moved on from that. But especially towards the end of this passage, I was a bit, I wasn't sure whether I would trust the narrator on what he says there, especially the last sentence when it says, and the foreigner had learned to speak the emperor's language, or the emperor to understand the language of the stranger. I wasn't too sure of that, because there's never been this middle ground where they kind of could start from and then explain the different meanings from there.
So there's this almost mystical progression from this language that is made of gestures to this language that is apparently made of words, but there's been no really kind of verbal translation process there.
Yes, exactly.
I think, yeah, there is that kind of irony there where it's almost like it's quite an assertive line, almost like a happy ending kind of trope, that now we all understand each other, which is ironic as the passage was talking about how there's lots of ambiguities even just in certain objects meaning certain things, or even in the idea of copying. So you'd assume there'd be much more ambiguity and misunderstanding when it comes to like verbal communication.
Okay, great. So moving on this point of kind of ambiguity and multiple meanings, so we were just talking about an idea of development. But do you think that there is an idea of direct development, or is it more a kind of form of contrast?
That's an interesting question.
So I guess the question could also be rephrased as, more simply in the first part, what is it that this language of gestures and objects brings to the conversation, to the communication?
I think it brings a commonality and something to be shared that I guess then gets brought back at the end of the passage, where it's not just one person understanding another, it's like that mutual understanding.
So the object is kind of a shared space, a shared meaning, that they both can see the object. But so I guess then
it's the bridge, I think.
A bridge. And as Maga, you were just saying that just before, this idea of kind of space, right? This kind of multiple meanings that can happen. I suppose this leads more now to the second question. In order to answer which, we have to really look at the third paragraph here. Ma ciò che rendeva prezioso a Kublai ogni fatto o notizia riferito dal suo inarticolato informatore era lo spazio che restava loro intorno, un vuoto non riempito di parole. So, just to parse it then, in English, what is it that is precious to Kublai Khan about the conversations that he has with Marco Polo, according to this paragraph?
Well, to him, the precious thing is exactly the fact that there are no words, that there's this ambiguity in only the objects. And I thought this was the case because since there are no words, there's more of a space for creativity, and he sees those objects and he kind of tries to put them into context. He thinks about what Marco Polo might want to say by referring to them, but ultimately it's his interpretation of them.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
So this idea that the space itself is actually calling for interpretation. So then I guess coming back to my question about whether it's a development between this language of objects and gestures to this language of words, or whether in fact the two are separate languages that in a way need to be contrasted rather than considered as a kind of smooth development one to the other. Does the language of objects present more of this space for interpretation than the language of words?
I would say it does, give more space for interpretation because, as I said earlier, with the language of words, there's never been this middle ground where there's a few words that both of them speak and that they can build onto, but the objects are the only things that they can both understand, so they are a solid basis for the interpretation, whereas the words seem to be so, it seems to be impossible to actually grasp them, so that everything that the interlocutor is trying to get out of the words might be just a complete invention, whereas the objects are kind of a more solid basis.
And yet, it's around the objects that this space is created, isn't it? Because if we look at the final paragraph here, we've got, nomi isolati or secchi verbi, these kind of words describing words that are themselves quite fixed. Whereas the objects and gestures have these multiple interpretations given, right, in the second paragraph here. So we were saying that these multiple interpretations kind of present a space of thought, they call for interpretation, and they also kind of call forth a bit of imagination, right? Well, how do you guys imagine this space that Kubla Khan describes, or Calvino says as Kubla Khan enjoys?
I see it as like, I read it as quite like playful, almost in like the kind of, if we see this as like a meta literary text in which means like looking at the text, talking about writing. It's almost that idea of a blank page and there being nothing there, and you kind of have to fill it with your own words or interpretation. And I guess that's why Kubla Khan kind of likes that, because it's his own power to decide what means what and bring his own kind of cultural and general ideas in the same way that the writer has to do that with a blank page, maybe.
Yeah, I think playful was a good sort of keyword to describe what's going on in this situation. Since it's this whole kind of creative freedom that the interlocutor has to sort of interpret a story from the objects.
And he does create a physical space out of it, doesn't he? Ci si poteva girare in mezzo col pensiero, right? So it is a space created in his imagination, created of thoughts. So from this language of objects and gestures, we've now got a kind of thought space that is, however, physical. You know, you could walk around it, lose yourself, stand there to take in the fresh air, right? So he's kind of constructing this more physical space out of this communication. Okay, so I guess this kind of leads us to the last question then, or this broader discussion of, you know, could this passage be considered a metaphor? And if it could, what would it be a metaphor for?
I thought that the metaphor to be found in this passage is that the objects kind of serve as an illustration for how words and language work in general. It kind of shows us that words themselves can have lots of different meanings, and they kind of require this sort of context to try and make sense of them. But obviously there's no communication where one can always be 100% sure to have understood the other person. That's exactly what's happening with these objects.
Yeah, I agree with that, but maybe perhaps more simplistically, I saw it almost as a metaphor about metaphor, in the sense that I think the Greek word for meta is like brings about this idea of moving, and so it's like moving one idea to another person, and so and that's kind of what the whole passage discusses, not just words and symbols, but also gestures and general language that's being transported from one person to the next.
A kind of communication of meaning as a form of transport, right? And I guess that another aspect of metaphor we can consider as well is this notion not just of kind of bridging, but also this notion of space and the lack in between. Because the basic constituent parts of a metaphor, right? You're likening two things. But by likening, you're also suggesting there is a fundamental, right, dissimilarity, because one thing is not the thing that you say it is. You know, night's candle is not actually because, you know, the night has a candle, but you're referring to the moon, but you haven't said the word moon. So although the moon is present, the moon is also not there. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that space, right, this kind of missing element, and whether you find any of that reflected in this passage here.
Yeah, I thought about this, this likening process, and at first I wasn't quite sure whether I would actually find a metaphor in there, because there's such a focus on language that I thought, wait, hold on, there can't be a metaphor for language in language. But I'm not entirely sure about that anymore, because then I thought that it was the objects that were kind of likened to words. Yes, that's what I came up with in the end.
I guess they definitely do dwell on the space, but also on that kind of idea of multiplicity of meanings. with, for example, the hourglass, which can like significare il tempo che passa o che è passato, oppure la sabbia. So it has that. It's laying out 3 different meanings, and I think it makes us engage with the idea of kind of what Pauline said at the very beginning of language learning, because we have to think about the context and who we are being spoken to, who we're speaking to rather, to kind of figure out that space.
Because in the end they end up with this kind of shared language, or maybe, as we were kind of hinting at before, maybe just a shared understanding of metaphor, right? Of this shared kind of interpretative space. Lo straniero aveva imparato a parlare la lingua dell'imperatore, o l'imperatore a capire la lingua dello straniero. So either Marco Polo is speaking the same language as the emperor, or the emperor understands Marco Polo's language. Do you think there's a difference there between speaking and understanding?
Well, it is kind of portrayed as if there isn't, because of this or. It just seems to be the same thing, like, oh, either this happened or that, and it's kind of the same thing, like, as long as there is some sort of understanding. But I feel like there definitely is a difference.
I think it's whoever's doing the kind of understanding that kind of gets explained in the last sentence with the or, because it's the idea of who's doing the capire.
Okay, so who is kind of receiving this communication?
Yeah.
Great. And so my last question is, do you think that it's a language of words at the end? Do you think they're speaking to each other in a verbal language?
I would say not in the classical sense. So there might be words being used, but maybe it's invented words, because we only sort of hear about this transition from objects and gestures to sounds, which then are supposed to form words and phrases, but we don't know whether this is actually something that exists, or whether Marco Polo thinks he's speaking this person's language but is just making up things, and the other person thinks that he speaks his own language, or maybe a situation like that. So yeah, I think there is a sort of verbal communication, but without necessarily conveying the sense in the actual words.
Although there's the idea of le parole andarono sostituendosi, so it is replacing the gestures and the symbols, but I guess the gerund of sostituendosi means it's like an ongoing process, that it's not finished and it hasn't got there quite yet, but it's happening. Words are replacing or having more importance than gestures and objects as symbols.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the final symbol would be the fact that we see the written words on the page, right? Which are themselves a symbol of things that are not there, right? They are requiring us to use the space of our own imagination to reach out and to kind of walk around them like Kubla does, to take in the fresh air. Great, well, thank you so much for reading this text with me today, and I hope that everyone watching has also enjoyed exploring it.